What's up everyone, and thank you for stopping by. Today's project is this Toro lawnmower, and I've been told that the problem is that it starts and runs, but it started smoking, so it was put on the curb to be given away. Let's take a good look at it, find out what's wrong with it, and hopefully we can fix it. In this video, we try and repair this mower. However, it may not be the exact repair you need to make to yours. We'll explore other options later in the video. So I saw an ad for a free mower, and after arriving at the location, I was able to speak to the owner, which is something I do not like doing. The reason is, more often than not, the information they give me gets in the way of diagnosing the actual problem. That's exactly what's going to happen today with this one. I try to diagnose the problem, but what they told me doesn't add up. To start, I'm going to look over the mower and see if there are any obvious issues. The first problem is that the end of the self-propelled cable where it attaches to the handle is broken. That's not a big deal. We can just temporarily fix it with some wire and replace the cable later on once we know the mower works well. Try not to order parts for your project that don't directly affect the engine's operation until you know that it's a good investment. You certainly don't want to order this cable only to find out that the rest of the mower is scrap metal. It may take more time to finish a project, but at least you won't waste your money. Now, the most likely cause for an engine to blow smoke out of the muffler is its burning oil. That means we need to check to see if the oil level is low. This is a good time to remind you, you cannot simply remove the dipstick and check the oil level. You need to wipe off the dipstick and then press it against the threads to correctly measure the oil level on this particular engine. Unfortunately, it looks as though the oil level is below the low mark because it's not even on the end of the stick. Hopefully it wasn't ran like this for long, otherwise this would definitely hurt the engine. Just for fun, I want to see just how low it is, so I'll screw it all the way in and see if it even shows up on the end of the stick. As you can see, even screwing the dipstick in, the oil is barely on it, so at least we know there's some oil in the engine. We'll find out if the engine has been damaged due to lack of oil once we get it running. I'll put in a few ounces so it's not low, and then check the gasoline in the tank, which there is some in it, and it does not smell stale. The next thing I want to do is a test start so we can see the problem firsthand. So unfortunately, the engine did not start, which is kind of strange considering that the owner said it was working. However, they didn't mention that it was tough to start either. Now, one reason why an engine would be tough to start is if the blade was damaged. Sometimes if you hit something hard enough, the blade will have a gouge in it, and if that happens, then it could affect the ignition timing, making the engine harder to start. There are some small nicks on the edge, but I don't see anything serious enough to cause a hard start. The next thing I want to do is put some gasoline into the carb's throat and see if the no-start situation is fuel-related, but this is when we find out that the air filter has been severely mangled. If we take it out of the cover, you can see that it's completely clogged with dirt. Now, I've seen dirty filters before, but this one looks to be so bad that the air couldn't pass through it, and the vacuum created by the engine pulled it into this strange shape. Now, since the clogged filter was restricting so much air, the vacuum from the engine ended up pulling a lot of the oil through the emissions hose, and that's probably the reason why it was smoking. The other cause for a smoking engine would be worn rings or a damaged cylinder wall, which we should be able to tell by using a compression tester. Now, since the filter was not sitting against the base like it should, it allowed a lot of dirt to enter the engine, so we might be looking at worn piston rings as well. With the restriction gone, I think it's worth a shot to try another test start. Unfortunately, it still didn't start. Now, since this engine hasn't even tried to start, the next thing I want to do is check to make sure that we have spark by using a spark checker. Now, you can find these online for just a few dollars. To use it, just install it in line with a spark plug, pull the rope, and watch for an orange glow. It's best if you have a helper to either watch or pull the rope, and it's also suggested to try this in a shady area. I know it was hard to see, but there was an orange glow in the tester. I've isolated a few frames so you can see what it should look like. That means we do have a working ignition system. If you don't see a glow, then you might have a bad ignition coil. The next thing I want to do is check to see if the engine is worn out. The easiest way to figure that out is to use a compression tester. Now, you can find these online for less than $20, and to use it, just remove the spark plug, install the tester, pull the rope several times, and the gauge should show a reading in PSI. Now, since this engine has a compression release, the reading will not be accurate, but we want to see a reading well over 90 PSI for a healthy engine. Anything lower than that means this engine has some wear on it. Now, after removing the spark plug, I can see it's covered in carbon from burning oil. That could be the reason why the engine hasn't started for us yet. We might have a working ignition system, but it may not be getting past the plug. To check it out, I'm going to use my spark plug tester and see if it's still working. Surprisingly, it looks like the plug still works, but if I can't get the engine started again, we might have to replace the plug. For the meantime, I'm just going to leave it alone and continue installing the compression tester. So the reading is extremely good at 95 psi. That means that although this engine was inhaling some dirt for a while, the engine is extremely healthy. Now, since I have access to the spark plug, I might as well try putting some gasoline directly into the engine and try yet another test start. So unfortunately, it did not start yet again. My guess is that I've flooded the engine from all my repeated attempts to start it. So I want to try and clear the flood by spinning the engine over with the drill. I also want to check to see if the flywheel key is partially sheared. If it is partially sheared, the ignition timing will be off and will make starting the engine a little tougher than it should be. So here's the flywheel and the top of the key, and it doesn't appear to be sheared, but what I'm going to do is remove it anyway just to make sure. To remove the flywheel, I'm going to use a puller, but there is another way if you don't have a puller available. Also, make sure that you release the flywheel brake by tying down the brake handle before you try and remove it. So this is the key, and as you can see, there isn't any damage to it. It looks exactly the way it's supposed to, which is just a rectangular piece of metal. That means the ignition timing has not been altered by a sheared key, so we'll continue on with the diagnostic. Since there isn't anything wrong with it, I'll just replace the flywheel so we can do yet another compression test. So the new reading is a lot higher than before at 150 psi, and that's because we're able to spin the engine fast enough to override the compression release. That means that this engine is extremely healthy with hardly any wear to the piston rings or the cylinder wall, and is definitely worth fixing. Now, even though I'm pretty sure the carb is fine, I'm going to remove it for a quick inspection. I'm not going to do an in-depth inspection because I don't want to waste your time showing you that there's nothing wrong with it. I'd rather focus on the parts of this repair where there's at least some sort of issue to look at. Besides, while these parts are off the engine, I can give them a good cleaning as well. I really do like this type of automatic choke system. I think they work very well. However, you have to remove the thermostat from the muffler to take off the carb. It's not a big deal until you realize that the newer Honda engines have a thermostat in the head that activates the choke, which means you don't need linkages like this anymore. So it's a lot easier and quicker to service them. Like I said, I don't want to spend too much time doing this inspection, but after removing the bowl, there were some sediments in it. However, it was very fine, so I doubt it was enough to clog the fuel jet. Now, once the main jet was out, you can see right through it, which means it wasn't clogged and in working condition. I also took the emulsion tube out, and it was clear as well, which means that there was nothing wrong with this carb. I'll put it back together off camera, and in the meantime, I want to put some gasoline directly into the engine and try starting it again. I know the last thing it needed was more gasoline in the engine, but I needed to hear it run, which it did very briefly. But before I put everything back on the mower, there is one thing I want to try, which is to put the carb back on the engine, put some gasoline in the fuel line, and try starting it to see if it'll run on its own. I think I've tried to start this engine several times, with most ending in failure, but I needed to hear it run because of what the owner told me. That bit of information is something that I needed to confirm, which is one reason why I don't like getting extra information. I would rather start with absolutely zero information and gather my own facts versus having to wade through misinformation. Not that I don't value information, but more often than not, it's not as helpful as I was hoping it was going to be. I do apologize, but the engine stopped while I was moving the camera, but it did run for about 2 minutes or so before it ran out of gas. I really do need to get a small fuel tank to use on these test starts. It would make it a bit easier than trying to fill the fuel line with my squeeze bottle. It did seem to be running a little bit slow, so I put a little bit more tension on the governor spring to increase the engine speed. However, don't get carried away, otherwise you could damage the engine if it's running too fast. Even though the engine only ran for a few minutes, the muffler where the thermostat is 163 degrees Fahrenheit, which is apparently more than enough to open the choke flap, which is exactly what's supposed to happen. Since we have the laser thermometer out, let's see what the rest of the engine readings are. Now the valve cover is 103 degrees, the side of the cylinder is almost 126, the bottom end of the block is 110 degrees, and finally the carb itself is 95, which is the air temperature right now. Now it's been a few minutes since I took those readings and it's cooled down a little bit, as you can tell, because the choke flap is partially closed. Let's try that again and see how well it starts when it's warm. It did take a few pulls to get it to start, but that's not too bad for this type of choke system and for not having the air filter on the carb. I also tried opening the choke all the way, and the engine didn't seem to care if it was partially choked or completely open, which is good news. This would be a great opportunity to put an aftermarket fuel shutoff valve on the fuel line. That way we have the option to run the fuel system dry between uses. The problem is that most people never bother using the valve, so I'm not going to install one just yet. The last thing we need to do is put the rest of the air box back on the engine. Now I didn't have this type of air filter available at the time of filming, but I did order several and will put one on when they arrive. Now I don't work on Kohler engines very often as opposed to Briggs and Hondas, and I think that's because they're not as popular. Unfortunately, I'm seeing more and more unbranded overseas engines on new lawn equipment lately, as I'm sure there's a higher profit margin when using those engines. Another reason why this engine would be smoking is that there's too much oil in it. That's one reason why you shouldn't overfill your engine. The extra oil will find its way to the combustion chamber, causing it to burn the oil. If that happens, you can dump some of the oil out of the engine and the smoke should clear up soon afterwards. So my question is, if your mower started blowing smoke out of the exhaust, what would you do? Would you try and diagnose the problem, or just give up on it and buy another mower instead? Personally, I would try and figure out what the problem is, and if I didn't have a good answer for that, I'd ask a friend to help me figure it out. Thank you for watching. I really do appreciate your time here. Please feel free to ask me any questions, and I hope to see you in the next video.